Hey folks, welcome to another story time with Max. If you don't know me, I am Max Porter, writer, editor, lore keeper, board game designer, and various other things, stream runner, story reader here at City State Entertainment. And we're working on Camelot Unchained, and I am going to read a story from our lore tonight. The story I'm going to read will be The Becoming the Picts Part 2, also known as Brood in the Picts Part 2. Looks like we've got some folks joining me on the stream, so I guess I'll go ahead and read. So, to give you a bit of context, if you haven't read The Becoming Picts Part 1 recently, essentially we were introduced to the character of Brood, who is a king of a tribe of Picts in the world of Camelot Unchained. Lodoween, when did you read Part 1? Quite a while ago. Or not that long ago, I guess, but, yeah, I don't remember specifically. It's been a few weeks. Oh, I think our tree just turned on, our eternal tree. We just published this story, Picts Part 2, in the most recent newsletter. So, seems good time to read it. So as I was saying, we met the character of Brood, king of a tribe of Picts. His magical tattoos were trying to tell him something, and he meditated on that and also got a sort of a mental report from his magical falcon, dressed, and he then sort of called a gathering of the tribe, and through a ritual, they sort of voted on what they wanted to do about the scouting report, which was that a Tuatha De Danann spy or scout had been seen sneaking through Pictish lands. So the tribe decided to go to war. And that is where Part 1 ended. So, The Becoming the Picts Part 2. After the ceremony of tattoos, images, and discussion with the tribe had ended, when the Picts, goblins, and other friends beneath the hill had filed out of the meeting place, Brood remained behind in the stone circle. As the glow of the shapes on the stones slowly faded, he sat for a long time in the dark hall, thinking. He did not know how to conduct a war, and the elders would not know either. It was for this reason he needed to harden his resolve, and find the determination to drive out the invading Tuatha De Danann. He and all of his people needed to learn. The decision had been made by the whole tribe. The king stood and left the hall to begin the many necessary preparations. One busy week later, there came a clear day with a pale blue sky, disturbed by a gusting breeze, one of those windy days that often bodes rougher weather. Brood was motionless in the middle of the village, though his hair whipped about along with his rippling tattoos. He was taking the measure of a man that stood before him, shouting, a braggart, a middle-aged warrior who had more pride than skill. Accosted by one of his loyal, or so he thought, subjects, Brood had been interrupted in his work, preparing his weapons and armor. Others looked on, as the braggart, a large, hairy Pict with a crooked nose, continued his tirade. "It's no good, King Bredet. You're letting the other tribes put one over on us. We may have agreed to war, but not to be wiped out in the first wave." Shaking his head at the rudeness and familiarity that he knew most kings would not allow, Brud Bredet Macbilly set down the whetstone and blade he had been carrying, and leaned his hands on his waist, staring down at the shorter Pict. "Well, I'm glad you feel you can talk to me man this way, Necton. It so happens, I agree. We do not wish to be wiped out in the first wave. And that, I think, is why we must be among the first of our peoples to fight and learn the ways of war." Necton frowned angrily, snarling like a dog. "Do you see that?" The man pointed at the southern horizon, where dark clouds gathered in angry scuds, visibly shredded by high-up winds. "A storm approaches. It will surely be here by tomorrow night. Do you really want us to be caught out in the open with no shelter?" Troubled, Brud shielded his eyes from the sun and looked to the south. He had been so focused on his work, the many concerns of a king and warlord, with supplies, weapons, and training, that he had not paid much attention to the sky. Watching the distant sky shapes, which looked suspiciously like veil sign, he said nothing for a moment, and Necton continued his tirade. "The last time the sky looked this way, it brought destruction and doom to all in the land. Can we not wait and hide a little longer? It is not a question of bravery, but of skill. You of all people should know the tendency of young kings to overreach, to try and prove themselves too soon." Necton's voice was quieter now, cajoling. His confidence was evident. He had embarrassed the king with his arguments, and now brought in what he appeared to think was the capstone of his point. "Let one of the other tribes try to repel the invaders first. With time, you will see I am right." "There is no time to lose." Brud raised his voice so that the weavers and shield makers looked up, listening. "Not if we are to regain our skills, not if we are to become the warrior people we once were." Brud cleared his throat and spoke with bold assurance so that onlookers could hear, craning their necks in the stiff breeze that swelled from the nearby forest. "I have heard your words, and will consider them, Necton. But remember this. It is given to me to wear these tattoos of prophecy, and it was decided by all of our tribe, coming together as one. We chose war." Surprised by the sudden vehemence and sound, Necton shrank back a bit, looking to see if any nearby would show him support. Only one face was turned toward him, the sour-mouthed Mael, a skilled healer who had long been Necton's partner in disagreement. Brud did not wait to see if any further cracks in his authority would appear. "Now I shall go and consult with my scout to see what news there may be of enemy movements and of the weather. See to your bow and spear, Necton. You may have need of them very soon." With that, he made a gesture of farewell and turned away. Brud didn't want his people to see his reddening face, or how his tattoos were shifting, irritated. Such insubordination was not a good sign. Certainly he'd learned to endure it well enough growing up, and it was up to him to deal with the fears and uncertainties of a people unused to all-out war. However, this problem would not cease. He would not be respected until he had truly proven himself as a commander. He walked away, feeling the thoughtful eyes of his people on his back. He had done well as a young king so far, but that did not mean the tribe could fully trust his decisions in battle. They had chosen war, Now he would have to show them that their choice was right, and that their tribe of Picts would not prove weaker than the others. He climbed up to the rocky promontory, the falcon's nest, where he had often gone to meditate and interpret the shapes of his tattoos. Now they were forming strange, indeterminate whorls on his chest and arms, odd half-images that indicated uncertainty and a murky future. Raising one hand high, Brood whistled piercingly and sought out his falcon with his mind. Drest was nearby, returning from another long flight south to scout out the land for enemies. The winged shape appeared as a shadow overhead, circling down from a great height. Swooping, the gray and brown feathered figure came to rest on Brood's outstretched arm. Fierce eye boring into his master, Drest eased the penetrating grip of his talons so that Brood barely felt them. His mind forming the connection, Brood experienced Drest's memories. He saw the broad, sweeping view of the world, each leaf of the many-colored forest fluttering beneath the falcon's keen eye. He saw the green meadows and the great gray stones that had lain there since time immemorial. He saw the dark shadows in between the rolling hills of the domain controlled by his tribe, and the streams that marked the border with the lands of another tribe. At last he came to the telltale marks of a small camp, deep in the pleasant forest. Tents hidden expertly among the trees, and bows leaning on tree trunks, along with quivers bristling with arrows. Well hidden indeed, but not to the clear eyes of a falcon. In memory, catching a glimpse of movement, Drest circled lower, wind rushing past his feathers to get a closer look. The leafy canopy appeared to sweep up toward him, then closed around with welcoming branches. As the falcon fluttered to rest in the top of a tree, he saw the soldiers at last. Camouflaged, in colorful armor, the Tuathan warriors communicated in low voices or gestures that Drest couldn't understand. The falcon simply watched and listened for a few moments. Then one of them made a gesture Drest could understand, very clearly indeed. Angry-faced, one of the heavily armed soldiers pointed up toward the tree where the falcon perched, and snatched up a bow and quiver. Without waiting any longer, the bird took to the air once more, putting plenty of foliage between himself and the enemy. Then it was a straight flight back to his master, calling on the wind from his stony outcropping on the hill above the village. Brood shook himself, both his body and his tattoos shivering, as he came out of the trance that let him share the falcon's memories. Drest, annoyed, fluttered off to a nearby tree stump and glared. "Thank you, my friend," Brood said quietly, his heart thudding with the realization that the invaders had truly arrived in force. "Now I must go and tell my warriors that we are to march tonight." They spent the evening making their war paints and applying them. Shapes and sigils bright blue on the skin of warrior men and women who intended to fight for their homeland. Most of the tribe would go, for their king wished to blood them in battle and teach them the ways of war. Briefly, the ceremony of war was held, drummers beating out the slow, powerful rhythm as the fierce images were painted on. Brood readied his own weapons and looked to the supplies that they would carry with them. Hearts began to beat in time with the deep-voiced drums, awakening to thoughts of blood and wrath. Brood's tattoos, which had been shifting and uncertain all day, finally settled into a definite shape, sharp angles and eye-like whorls and lines, speaking of the battle to come. He felt ready, knowing the enemy's position and approximate number. He felt confident, thinking of the path they would have to take through the woods to come at them from downwind. It would mean a circuitous journey, and would take his warriors through lands controlled by another Pictish tribe. But they should come upon the enemy camp, unexpected in the earliest morning hours, when the mist would give his people all the advantages. Thinking through his strategy, Brood set off into the woods at the head of his troops in a dreamlike state, the drums of war still pumping through his blood. The forest had its own beat, its own rhythm, which he attuned to as he ran through it, formed of the wind in the trees, the pattern of his feet, pounding on the fallen leaves, and the nearly silent leaps over fallen logs and underbrush. His soldiers, painted in their wild war paint, followed after almost as quietly, putting their lives in his hands. Though the Tuatha De Danann were renowned for their woodcraft, masters of moving in the woods and wild lands, yet this was Pictish territory. Brood felt certain that no one, not even these wily stalkers from foreign lands, could move as swiftly or as surely, and never as stealthily, as Brood's tribe in their own familiar home. As the Picts settled into the loping run that would eat up the distance, they began to sense a change in the woods. Brood was leading them in a new direction, one that circled around the enemy to attack at a different angle. They leapt over a new stream and thought this strangeness came from that. But there was something else, a wrongness, something other, an outside presence in this place. Trees, wind, perhaps the scent on the wind. Then again, it could have been simple changes in the forest they were entering. This was a different part of the wild lands, controlled by a different tribe of Picts. Their ways are our ways, but we are different, Brood reminded himself. Hopefully, their passage would go unnoticed this night. It was often dark enough, at least. The clouds were gathering, blowing across the moon and stars from the southern horizon. There was a tension in the air, beyond mere trepidation for the coming fight, a presage of the coming storm. All these thoughts ran through his head, beating their musical staccato notation out in time with his footprints in the night. What was this unfamiliar presence, this strange pattern to the forest? Had the enemy come upon them? How? No, it must be the other tribe. They were out this night as well. Brood had not seen them coming, hidden in their woods with their own war paint and gleaming wet weapons. With a rumble of release, the storm broke upon them, pouring down rain in waves. Thankfully, it did not yet have the force of a veilstorm. No changing magics, no earth-rending forces were at play. It was simply a storm, wrathful, but not utterly destructive. It was dark, and the fight was quiet in the raging storm. Still, the hush of the rain was broken by yells, the clashing of blades, and the occasional pained scream. Few could stand against King Brood Brede Macbilly, mighty warrior that he was. He cut his way past one fighter after another, narrow misses in the dark, with little real resistance, for all seemed as surprised as he was. That is, until he crossed blades with a short but powerful warrior of great skill, who threw back his assault with a deadly force at least equal to his own. So fast was this warrior that the rain barely seemed to touch skin or steel as the fight spun on. All was confusion, and he had to parry by the flicker of blades in moonlight, or simple guesswork from brief lightning flashes. They fought with increasing eagerness, chasing through the forest, leaping off of fallen logs and battering one another with their Pictish blades as the storm battered them with wind and rain. Brood quickly lost track of his warriors in the chaotic battle, seeing only vague figures slashing and cutting all around. The short warrior came at him again, teeth flashing in a grin, and as lightning struck in a struck in a long bolt not far away, all was laid bare in stark brightness for a moment. It was a woman, muscular and lithe, painted in blazing streaks across her shoulders and face. He ducked her blow, but felt the tip of her blade slide through his skin in a shallow cut on his forehead, just above the eye. His blood pumping hard, it poured down his face with the rain. But Brood was quick enough to lash out, his reactive instincts jerking his sword up. The tip pierced her shoulder. Snarling in pain like a wild wolf, she leaped back, pulling free of his blade and spraying blood of her own. Her foot slipped on a slick root, but she thrashed about and caught herself on the nearby tree trunk. For a moment, they just stood there, panting, heavily, and bleeding. Brood was half kneeling in the muddy leaves, while she leaned against the damp tree trunk, her chest heaving in the moonlight that shone down once more as the wild winds tore the clouds apart high above. His breath as ragged as the storm clouds, Brood rose to his feet and pointed his bloody weapon at her. "We did not come to raid or take you captive. We seek the intruders upon Pictish lands who make their hidden camp in our hiding places." The other warrior eyed him darkly, her teeth pulling back in a smile. "We too make war. But for this storm, we would have already been crossing blades with these Tuaharidanan spies. Now that you've stumbled blindly into our war troop, we shed blood too soon." There was a pause, as thunder rumbled all around them, drowning out the sounds of swift and deadly fighting in the dark. Thus ends the second part of the tale. You can expect part 3 quite soon, probably in the next newsletter. But thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed. We're going to have more streaming tomorrow. Join me in the morning for Morning with Max, where I'll just kind of close out the end of the week of streaming. And that will be followed by, in the afternoon, the end of week wrap-up. I think that will probably be with Tyler and or Andrew. So join us for that if you can. And that will be followed by Q&A, as always. Anyhow, thanks again. See you later. And I'm going to turn this off now. So, bye-bye.
Yeah.